What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Jake and I really appreciate everybody checking out the draft reviews we've been doing. Been getting a lot of attention. We have one more coming out. Should be dropping Monday this week, so really excited for that. But today we are here to talk about year one and kind of year two tight end values. So Jake and I have been having this running conversation for a while. We've also been talking about this on the podcast on our main show quite a bit for some time. And the Dynasty landscape, or maybe really the NFL landscape, has changed a little bit with how they're utilizing tight ends. So maybe things have changed and we wanted to really dig into the data. And what the conversation has been is, do tight ends hold their value through year one to year two? That's really what the conversation has been. Are they worth paying up for in the rookie draft, right? A lot of these guys like Dalton Kincaid this year, we have Brock Bowers, a lot of these guys being pushed up into the first round of the rookie drafts, thinking back to Kyle Pitts even. Were they really worth spending that draft capital on, that first round rookie draft capital on that is so valuable? And that's kind of been what Jake and I have really struggled with and what we've been, talking about. And I think we've been giving a lot of advice kind of like, it's really not worth spending that first round pick. You can generally get them cheaper. So we wanted to dig into the data a little bit more. And so we pulled the data for the last 5 years of tight ends, their finishes, to kind of see what this actually looks like in reality, right? So before we hop into the data, Jake, do you have anything that I might have missed here in kind of going over like the goal of what we're looking at?
No, that's exactly it. We've been really crunching through the idea of when is the best time to acquire a quote unquote elite draft capital tight end, meaning first round NFL draft capital tight ends. Is it in the rookie draft or is it not? And I think that's what we're going to go over today.
Let me pull up the data here for the tight ends, what we've been collecting. So up here we have the last 5 years of tight end data in terms of hit rate, right? And so what we're looking at here in terms of hit rate, we have I pulled a couple different things. I pulled the number of top 12 seasons they've had, number of top 5 seasons they've had, the year one hit rate, whether they hit top 12 in year one or top 5 in year one. Okay, so what I'm going to do here to just make it a little bit easier for us to look at, I don't have anything filtered right now. I have year one ADP as well. I have year two ADP, then the ADP delta between the two to see, how far they've risen up, from year one to year two, or how far they've declined from year one to year two in terms of ADP. So those are kind of the main data points we're looking at. I have kind of a hit rate status over here, and I'll explain that when I filter it down a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just filter for the tight ends who have had a top 12 season, because I think that's kind of what we're most concerned with, right? Any of the other tight ends don't really concern us for this conversation, because what we're looking at is the tight ends who really mattered in year one. Did they maintain value through year two? So the first thing to note here, I think, is that the list of tight ends who have even had a top 12 season are very few and far between, right? We have a total of nine players right here who have at least had one top 12 season. So the way I've categorized the hit, just to be clear here, the way that I've categorized the status here is a superstar is one that has hit a top 5 season in his first season, in his year one season, which is just one. Sam Laporta, just absolutely incredible season last year. After that, if you've hit a top 5 season at all, I'm giving you an elite status. So that's TJ Hawkinson. If you've hit a top 12 season at all, I'm giving you the status of hit. Otherwise, you have missed. So outside of this list, we've technically missed on all the other tight ends who have had not much value. And honestly, I mean, it might be worth just kind of looking at something here. The ones who did have ADP year one, I'm surprised to see actually that their ADP increased. And this is something that Jake and I are going to talk through. And I think, the data is going to tell us something a little bit different than we expected maybe. But I'm interested to see that a lot of the guys who have missed have actually increased in ADP from year one to year two. Guys like Luke Musgrave, guys like Jelani Woods, maybe an Adam Troutman, a lot of hopium here, Tucker Kraft. Okay, so just for perspective, I just kind of wanted to look at that real quick. But going back to what we were talking about, the guys that have hit a top 12 season at least once, we wanted to see, has the ADP dipped for the most part from year one to year two or not? And it is not. So what we found is that 66% of this group has increased their ADP from year one to year two, 33% has decreased from year 1 to year 2. I'm gonna stop yammering on here. Jake, do you have anything you wanna toss in before I find something else to talk about?
I think you hit everything. The big thing here is just really honing in on the 3 tight ends that did drop. I think it was really down to circumstance. So you have TJ Hawkinson sitting in Detroit Detroit at the time. Pretty lackadaisical offense with, I think it was actually a Matt Stafford injury, if I remember correctly. And then Trey McBride coming in as basically tight end 2 with another major injury with Kyler Murray tearing his ACL, I believe, that season. And then Noah Fant, I don't remember all the way back then to 2019 with Denver. But if I had to guess, it was probably more circumstantial than anything else. And as you can see, his ADP didn't drop that significantly. I think it was like 12 spots. So just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, it has been a lot of it's really been contextual, right? Been poor situationally, injury related, a couple of different things there for the guys who did dip. So I think, for us, I think we're seeing something here we didn't quite expect. The data is definitely, I think, a little inconclusive. I mean, we're only looking at the past 5 years, right? I think we did that because we also wanted to see something that reflected what is really happening in the NFL right now more than what we've seen in the past, right? Because we have seen tight ends not really utilized in the way that they're being utilized. Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid are great examples of kind of the new age of the NFL and how they're, bringing these guys in and making them, big slots, if nothing else, almost immediately and like go to work. So we did want the data to kind of reflect that, but it does kind of punch a hole in our idea of, do tight ends kind of, dip in value from year 1 to year 2, and is there a window to kind of buy them? I mean, Kyle Pitts is interesting to look at from year 1 to year 2. He goes from 38 to 14. He had a really good year 1, obviously, right? That makes a lot of sense. But I think if we looked at his value kind of in between those times, we'd probably find some peaks and valleys that aren't reflected in this just static year 1 to year 2 look at their ADP, right? Because again, yes, year 1 to year 2 for Kyle Pitts was good, but then it kind of trailed off. And if we think about Pat Freiermuth, if we think about Cole Kmet, they've had some pretty big fluctuations in their values as well. And I think even Dalton Kincaid, for the most recent example, sure, he picked it up towards the end of the year, but I do think you probably could have got him for less, weeks 1 to week 7, right? When he was not really producing that well. So I do think that there's some dips in ADP that aren't reflected in the static data that we're looking at here. Do you think that that's a real thing, or do you think I'm kind of just like, finding what I want to find?
Yeah, I do think there's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. I think there's some truth, and I think there's probably some inherent bias that you're providing to the data, since we don't have those fluctuations in actual ADP available to show. But if anything, it highlights kind of the issues with buying tight ends at a premium. And so maybe their true premium, or maybe their best value for us based on what we're showing, is potentially at that initial ADP. Because let's say, like a Sam Laporta, for instance, if you're buying him now, just based off of the historic data that you're referring to, there's a strong chance that his ADP is going to drop at some point this year, right? So that means that his trade value is going to drop as well, whether that's due to injury or slight, stagnation, whatever it might be. That seems like a much more logical trend than the idea of not being able to buy him at the beginning and then waiting for his value to fluctuate. I think the fluctuation is probably going to happen between now, considering he's at ADP of 38. Is that probably the apex of his value? I'd say most likely, yes. You're seeing him around, I've even seen him at pick 27, 28 overall. So yeah, it's weird.
We may have jumped the shark a little bit on Sam Laporta and the elite tight ends in terms of kind of not predicting, but kind of believing what we've seen from year 1 and making that their true value, and picking them over, established players that we would typically pick them over
Mark
otherwise.
Andrews.
Yes, 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 yes. You know what I'm you know what I'm referring to. I'll always bring it back there somehow. Do you think that it's worth selecting the tight ends in the first round? Like, do you think that it's worth selecting, going back at Dalton Kincaid last year in the first round, given kind of his value arc to now, or even a Brock Bowers this year?
Yeah, I really do think it is kind of similar to a lot of the conversations we bring up on the podcast as well. It really comes down to value. I think a Dalton Kincaid at like the 110 to 112 last year probably sees you a profit at some point towards the end of this past season, and that's
Hmm.
okay. I think drafting Dalton Kincaid, which I saw last year as early as the 106, maybe doesn't make as much sense. Brock Bowers is obviously coming in with a little bit higher of an ADP than Dalton Kincaid did, and so it's not necessarily a one-to-one comparison, but I have seen Brock drop all the way down to the 108 and 109. So if you're able to get him there, that value makes a ton of sense for me to snag him. Am I going to draft him over a Drake May, a Jaden Daniels? No, but I've seen him selected over them. So I think it's really just down to the context of what your own rookie draft is showing. And what we're showing here, at least, is that his value is kind of relatively insulated, which puts you in a pretty good spot to feel like the investment will at least be worth it for 12 to potentially 15 months.
Okay, so we might be changing our minds a little bit on how we view the year one tight end value arc. Yeah.
I would say that I'm changing my tune, yes, but I would also say that the data isn't conclusive enough for me to tell you either direction. And I think that's really
Hmm.
the big takeaway here is like we're showing at least like the data behind the reason why we are kind of disproving our point, but at the same time, I don't feel like the data is conclusive enough to really understand the value fluctuation of a year one to year two tight end. What about you?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying there. I do think that it's swaying me a little bit in the other way in terms of understanding the actual value arcs that are happening. I do feel like there's still these windows where you can attack these year one, year two tight ends. I do really quickly want to bring up another view here, if you can indulge me a little bit.
Always.
We're looking at we're looking at DLF here, their ADP tracker. And we're looking at Kyle Pitts first, just kind of for an example. And you can see that there are some pretty stark value dips here. Now, some of them are later, right? We're seeing kind of a year three, like a major year three dip there
Yep.
below his original value, essentially. But you're also seeing these value dips going into year two a little bit, right? Where things got really shaky, I think, in 2022. And that kind of like steadily decrease through year three. So I think this is a more realistic view of kind of what's potentially happening, and then we can take it, another step further and look at also Dalton Kincaid a little bit here, right? Who we just had his year one. We haven't necessarily gone fully into year two, and you're seeing that his value did increase, but you're also seeing these little dips, right? Like these peaks and valleys throughout year one. And I do think that there were windows here within the first year within that, what are we in, with June through August area,
Hmm.
right? And even through October, there was, I think, some windows to purchase Kincaid, and then you see another dip there in February of 24 before I think things really shifted with the Bills. But you're seeing these small value dips in the position, and I think a lot of players, obviously, you're going to see value dips like that. But with tight ends, I do feel like you don't always need to pay the premium in your rookie draft. I do feel like there are those windows, but I am being swayed to the idea that those windows might be a lot smaller than I was originally thinking, and that the value actually may be better than I'd been thinking, right? Like the return on your investment for spending a first round pick on a tight end is probably still there. Like you don't need to avoid it at all costs. But to Jake's point, is the 106 really worth it with all the fluctuation that is potentially going to happen with that position? Man, it's really, really hard for me to say yes to that question. You know what I mean? One more thing I want to point out before we sign off here, going back to our data, all but one player were round 2 picks or greater. One player, Dawson Knox, was a round 3 player. So you can see right here, column D, we have draft round. So the only player here with a draft round greater than 3 who had a top 12 season in the last 5 years was Dawson Knox. So I did see a lot of stuff going around Twitter about talking about Ben Sinnott. I'll bring this back to a tight end this year in the rookie draft, but talking about Ben Sinnott and about how draft capital isn't that important for tight ends. And we have seen, obviously, George Kittles, like Mark Andrews, like guys have obviously come from later rounds for sure. That has happened, and some of the best tight ends have for sure. But over the last 5 years, in terms of fantasy production, the top 12 players have all come from round 3 or better, and only one of those players came from round 3. So it does feel like there is some level of significance to it in the new NFL landscape, right? We have to acknowledge that things have changed a little bit from when George Kittle, Mark Andrews, those guys were drafted. It's not the same landscape. They aren't viewing tight ends the same. These guys who have the dual threat ability, right? So I think that that is a big part of this discussion that kind of goes a little understated. And I wanted to get it out there, just kind of looking at the data. That's something that stuck out to me. Before we get out of here, Jake, is there anything else that sticks out to you about year 1, year 2 tight end data?
No, I think the last point I was going to make is exactly what you finished off on. And I think the biggest thing with regards to Dawson Knox too is both him and Pat Freiermuth, actually. And we had this conversation offline. Their value in those specific years were strictly down to touchdowns. And so that's another thing that you need to look at in terms of tight end valuation, is when basically their value is, connected and perfectly correlated with touchdown production. The reality of them being able to insulate their value is going to be really, really low. You're really looking for high target, high reception, receiving tight ends versus, 10, 11 touchdown, 30 reception tight ends, because they're just not going to stay stable for you. And that's the only thing I really wanted to finish off on.
Yeah, no, great point. Very few top 5 seasons for these type of players early on in their careers. And in general, we only have 2 guys on this list who have hit top 5, and one of them has hit it 3 times. The rest of them have not hit it. So it's a fickle position, and we got to be really discerning. Like Jake's saying, touchdowns are not sticky for any position, but when it comes to tight ends specifically, when that's where the large majority of their fantasy points and production is coming from, you got to take notice and really react to that in the right way. And I think you look at this list, and it's those 2 guys definitely stand out. We'll see if one of them can turn it around. I don't think Knox has any chance, but that's okay. That's okay. This has been a really cool discussion. It's been really cool to kind of disprove something that we thought and maybe change our mind a little bit. Now, again, Jake, alluded to the fact that this data is not conclusive. It's only 5 years. There's definitely a lot more work to be done here, but I think it's a really good initial look at the position and kind of what's happening right now. So thank you all for indulging us. This has been a really fun conversation. If you guys have any questions, please let us know. Any thoughts, please send them to us in the YouTube comments. Thank you, everybody. Please like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.